I ask you to take revenge on my mother in my place. It has been 6 months since Phil passed away, and I visited his grave with Bart. Since his death, my heart has been a jar of great emptiness. His shadow was deeply etched in my mind, and I still thought of him. I couldn't forget the times we spent together, the places we visited, and the meals we ate. Why couldn't I free myself from his memories, even though I should move forward with my life? Phil wouldn't want to see me stagnating. Despite knowing this, there were unexpected moments when I thought of him and tears overflowed. Wanting to look ahead but not knowing how, I lived a life filled with worry. However, on the way back from the grave visit, a slightly bulging envelope given to me by Bart cleared my mind. A letter from Mr. Phil. This is what he wanted to convey and what he wanted to pass on. Suspicious, I took the letter from Bart and opened it at home. Inside, a USB emerged. The USB contained several letters and photographs. Upon checking the contents, it became clear that Phil had been involved in a difficult situation. Knowing this, I felt I had to face forward for his sake. My name is Betty White. I'm 35 years old. I work for a small regional company and live a calm life. Returning home from a workplace where the staff is kind, upon turning on the lights, there is no one to greet me as I am single. But that's not a problem. I have no intention of marrying anymore. In my heart, there is only one husband, him. Until 2 years ago, I had a husband named Phil by my side. However, he has left this world. He ended his own life. I met Phil during college, when I joined the club he was a part of. At first, we weren't very close. However, our relationship quickly grew closer after a drinking party. At that time, I was still underage and couldn't drink alcohol, so I watched the drunken seniors while sipping on a non-alcoholic beverage. After the party ended without incident, and we were about to go home, Phil and I realized we lived in the same direction. Are you heading back? Do you want to go together? Really? Are you sure? Yeah, I'm worried about a girl walking alone. Thank you. Despite having barely spoken before, Phil was considerate of me. His kindness was palpable, and for some reason, I felt embarrassed. The quiet of the night enveloped us, and only our footsteps could be heard. I felt a thrill from the ambience unique to this time of night, though it was also slightly awkward. There was no conversation. Since we hadn't really talked much before, it wasn't surprising that I felt awkward. Despite this, it was Phil who dispelled the discomfort. Sorry. Was it a bit noisy today? What? No. The drunk people were loud. I hope they didn't bother you. No, it's okay. Phil apologized while feeling embarrassed. I was just watching everyone having fun. I hope I can drink soon too. Really? Upon hearing my comment, Phil smiled warmly. From that simple remark, our conversation slowly began. We talked about our university life and shared our hobbies and favorite things. While it wasn't exactly lively, the interaction with Phil was pleasant. I hope to have such conversations with him again. That wish came true sooner than I expected. After walking home together that day, Phil started initiating conversations with me. We gradually began to walk home together more often, and that developed into a relationship where we enjoyed meals together, just the two of us. Half a year after that drinking party, we started going out. Though we were from different apartments, the time we spent together increased. Every day was filled with joy and happiness. Even after Phil started working, our bond did not change. After I started working, topics about the workplace and bosses increased, but our relationship continued just like in our university days. It was tough to blend into the workplace in the early stages of my career, and I often faced difficulties. However, I was able to overcome these challenges because of Phil's support. He was a wonderful person, and I was happy to be with him. I had always dreamed of marrying him, and it seemed he wished for the same future. 8 years after we started dating, Phil proposed to me. "I will definitely make you happy," he promised with a serious look. There was no reason to refuse. "I'm looking forward to that," I replied. And so, we got married and started a new life as partners. Our relationship did not change after marriage, and we were filled with happiness. While our new life was happy, adjusting to it also came with its struggles. Getting used to our new life together took some time, but during those times, my mother-in-law supported me. She had always been warm, and I heard that my late father-in-law was equally kind. Is there anything wrong, she would ask over the phone sometimes, and she would visit us as she lived nearby. She kindly taught me some cooking tips and everyday tricks, taking great care of me. We often enjoyed meals together. There was no specific day or time set, but it seemed she chose weekday nights when I came home from work. "I'll take care of everything, so just relax, Betty." "But I can't just leave everything to you. Don't worry about it. You must be tired from work." "Thank you." At first, I often felt guilty, but it seemed that my mother-in-law enjoyed spending time with us. Gradually, I became more natural around her without feeling the need to be overly considerate. Then, the tension I used to feel seemed to completely disappear. Phil is my only child. I really enjoy talking to someone of his generation. My mother-in-law treated me as if I were her own daughter. On holidays, we sometimes went shopping together or sat at home, enjoying our favorite teas and chatting. Since my own parents lived far away, I couldn't see them often, but I was very grateful for my mother-in-law's thoughtfulness. However, those peaceful days came to an abrupt end. The cause was my mother-in-law starting a cafe. I knew she had always wanted to open a cafe, so it wasn't a surprise. When Phil proposed quitting his job to help her, I was surprised, but I supported his decision. Until Phil's income stabilized, I decided to provide financial support. Perhaps due to a lack of competitors, my mother-in-law's cafe was more successful than anticipated. "It's busier than we thought. Mom seems happy." "That's wonderful. Do you have regular customers?" "A few." "That's good. I've had the cake a couple of times and it was delicious, so I can see why there are regulars." Phil blushed at my comment. The cafe continued to attract people non-stop, and it seemed they even received magazine interviews. The number of customers kept increasing. I'm happy to have so much support, and it's not too busy. But it's a bit hard since it's just the two of us. While Phil managed a wry smile, it was apparent he was pleased with the prosperity of the store. I was glad to see the business running smoothly, but as a year passed since its opening, I noticed Phil sighing more frequently. I wondered if I should ignore it, but the frequent sighs were concerning. I carefully chose my words to ask him about his situation. How have you been recently? Are you okay? What do you mean if I am okay? Well, you've been sighing a lot. I was wondering if something was bothering you. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Ah, you noticed that. It seemed he hadn't realized he was sighing unconsciously. Thinking his heart must be heavy, I felt even more worried. Actually, the cafe isn't doing so well. The cafe. Recently, a new store with a similar concept opened nearby my mother-in-law's cafe. That store is very sophisticated, and some of our regular customers have started going there instead. Business is still stable, but I'm worried about the future. Mom is also very troubled, and she always looks sad. That's tough. I heard about the new store but didn't know the details. I'm only interested in your mother's shop. Phil held his head and sighed deeply again. Talking might have lightened his burden a bit, but there was nothing much I could do. My support was limited to visiting the store myself and recommending it to acquaintances. When I visited after hearing about the situation from Phil, his mother indeed looked troubled, just as he had described. It was clear that the number of visitors had decreased, and the foot traffic was dwindling. Ah, Betty, you heard the details from Phil. Yes, I'm wondering how we should respond. I'm promoting it as best as I can. That's a big help. My mother-in-law offered a helpless smile from behind the counter and stared at her coffee cup. If the customers continue to decrease, if we are forced to close the shop, dark thoughts dominated my mind. As I drank coffee, I searched for other actions I could take, but my anxiety did not clear up quickly. However, a month after talking to Phil, the newly opened competing store closed down. As a result, my mother-in-law's store regained its popularity. The new store closed down. I was surprised. Yes, I was really surprised. My mother-in-law showed a satisfied smile while nodding. However, her reaction left some doubts. It seemed as if she had anticipated the store's closure in advance. But did you know about the closure beforehand? I couldn't bring myself to ask. I kept telling myself it might be my imagination as I continued the conversation with my mother-in-law. Phil, who was listening to the conversation, said, "It's good that customers are coming back." Yes, I'm happy as it is now, or even happier if more customers come. Phil nodded in response to my mother-in-law's words. There must have been some reason for the store's closure. While thinking this, I hoped for further prosperity for my mother-in-law's store. However, this event triggered a strange phenomenon in the area. Stores around my mother-in-law's cafe, except for hers, began to close down, one after another. At least 3 stores had closed down within a month. The stores that closed down were of the same type as my mother-in-law's cafe. Lately, stores around here have been closing a lot, haven't they? When I revisited my mother-in-law's store, I casually brought up the topic. Really, why is that? But it helps that customers from those stores come here. I felt that my mother-in-law was questioning the rapid rate at which stores were closing, but she didn't seem overly concerned. While she seemed surprised on the surface, her demeanor and way of speaking made me feel like she was hiding something. Weren't you close to the other stores? No, we did interact, but I never expected it to come to this. It's truly surprising. My mother-in-law appeared inwardly pleased that the stores were closing in succession. However, it was difficult for me to understand. In this situation, I would probably feel more fear than joy. 3 stores closing in a month is an extremely unusual situation. What is happening in this area? I could think of nothing, and no matter how much I pondered, I couldn't find an answer. Amidst the anomalies occurring in the area, Phil's behavior was particularly noticeable. Despite the store's success, the smile had disappeared from his face. He sighed as before and seemed downcast. Given the situation with the store, it seemed unlikely for him to look so troubled. Perhaps he had other worries. I decided to probe his concerns in the same casual way as before. How have you been recently? You don't seem very cheerful. Ah, really? Yes. He seemed unaware of how stressed he appeared, so I continued to watch his expression closely. However, Phil didn't seem inclined to talk, and unnaturally touched his nose while averting his gaze. It's nothing serious. Are you sure there's no problem? Yes, there's no problem, so please don't worry. Really, don't ask anything more. Saying this, Phil sighed heavily one last time and left. It was clear that he was troubled. However, without him opening up, the truth remained elusive. He would talk when he was ready. If he continues to choose silence, I must respect that decision. However, that choice turned out to be a mistake. I should have probed more actively into the situation, a regret that became apparent when 6 months after the stores closed, Phil passed away. His death was not due to illness or an accident, but by his own decision. He had indeed been suffering for a long time. His departure was a sudden and incomprehensible situation. Without time for the situation to settle, his funeral was swiftly arranged. How should I live from now on? How will my heart, having lost a loved one, heal? It was even more difficult to contemplate a future without him. My mother-in-law must have felt the same. I can't believe it. What are we supposed to do? She murmured softly in front of Phil's ashes. She had never imagined losing her son. They were very close, and the loss was immeasurable. Phil, why? Mother. I gently stroked her back. Her back felt much more fragile than I had expected. Yet, at that moment, I also sensed a slight discomfort. What should I do? She seemed agitated. Are you okay? While stroking her back, I asked her gently. Yes, I'm fine. She answered my question while trying to suppress her agitation. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I'm willing to do whatever I can." "Thank you, we'll talk about that later. For now, just leave it. Oh, since this house is in my name, could you move out once you've settled down?" I had never intended to live alone in a large house, so I answered, yes. Although it felt strange, given the necessity of accepting her son's death, it seemed there was no other choice. I decided not to dwell on unnecessary thoughts and to quietly support my mother-in-law. Time passed, and before I knew it, 6 months had gone by since Phil's death. Yet time alone moved on. I was still left behind in the days when Phil was alive. Even as I sorted through Phil's belongings and cleared the space we had shared, his presence did not leave my heart. Since his death, my heart has been a jar of great emptiness. We had spent so many years together. I knew it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten, yet his shadow was too deeply etched in my mind. I couldn't forget the times we spent together, the places we visited, and the meals we ate. Why couldn't I free myself from his memories, even though I should move forward with my life? Phil wouldn't want to see me stagnating. Despite knowing this, there were unexpected moments when I thought of him, and tears overflowed. However, a certain proposal strengthened my resolve to move forward again. One day, I received a call from an unexpected person. "Bart? It's unusual for you to call. What's up?" "Yes, just a little something." It was from Bart Cooper, a college classmate and a close friend of Phil's. We weren't very close, but the conversation flowed naturally. He had attended Phil's funeral, and I still clearly remember our conversation from that time. "Would you like to come and visit Phil's grave together? I have something to discuss." "A grave visit? No problem, but is your wife okay with it?" "Yes, it's fine." It seemed he had something he wanted to convey. I was concerned about Bart's wife's reaction, but it appeared to be no issue. 2 weeks later, I went with Bart to the cemetery where Phil was resting. "Are you okay? It's been tough since Phil passed away." "Yes, I've been able to go to work." "I see." After offering some flowers and greeting Phil at his grave, we moved away from the spot. It feels indescribable to be visiting Phil's grave at this age. Yes. Bart's somewhat awkwardly initiated conversation. Lacking the energy to expand the conversation, I quietly responded. Without continuing the conversation, silence lingered between us. However, that silence was soon broken by Bart's words. "Hey, there's something I wanted to tell you today." In the heavy atmosphere, Bart handed me a bulging envelope. A letter. Yes, a letter from Phil. He wanted me to pass this on, something he wanted to say, and something he wanted you to have. I hadn't expected that Phil had entrusted a letter to Bart. I took the letter and looked at the envelope. After Phil passed away, this letter arrived for me. It seems he had sent it beforehand. In the letter, he wrote that he wanted me to give this to you after 6 months had passed since his death. Why he had left the letter this way, and why after 6 months, filled my mind with questions. "This envelope contains Phil's feelings," said Bart. "May I see it?" When I asked, Bart checked the surroundings and shook his head, speaking in a low voice. "Look at it at home. Make sure no one finds it, especially not Phil's mother." Why, I asked. "That's what Phil wrote in the letter. I don't know what's inside, so please take care," Bart replied. He looked at me with a serious expression on his face. "Understood," I quietly answered, slipping the envelope into my bag. After parting with Bart, I hurried back home and opened the envelope in my room. What had Phil left behind? If it was something that needed to be hidden from his mother, it might not be something good. As I opened the envelope with trembling hands, filled with tension and fear, out came a USB drive, several photographs, and many sheets of letters. I'll read the letters first, I thought, picking up the thick stack of papers. "I ask you to take revenge on my mother." The words prominently written at the top sent chills down my spine. As I read further, shocking facts about my mother-in-law were revealed. They were incredibly shocking, and I couldn't immediately accept everything. Ah, right. The photos and the USB. I immediately began looking through the enclosed photos and the USB. Is this really? My thoughts stopped, and I became unsure of what to think. Understanding the true nature of the matter seemed beyond my grasp, and I was reluctant to comprehend it. But it was unavoidable. I picked up the letter again and continued reading. No matter how many times I read it, the content remained the same, and my hands trembled even more. My mother conspired with local gangsters. According to Phil's information, there was evidence that my mother-in-law had collaborated with local gangsters to benefit her store, and the proof was included on the USB and in the photographs. She had started seeking help from the gangsters when new stores opened nearby and began taking away her customers. The consecutive closures of the stores were all orchestrated by the gangsters at my mother-in-law's request. She first contacted them shortly after opening her store. The gangsters initially came to demand money, but she managed to drive them away. However, when a new store opened, they reappeared. They demanded, "We'll ruin the store for you, but you have to pay us." After much anguish, my mother-in-law agreed to pay the money in exchange for the gangsters' help in shutting down the competing store. After that, the connection between the gangsters and my mother-in-law grew even stronger. All of this was detailed in the letter Phil had left behind. Phil had witnessed the negotiations between his mother and the gangsters. In fact, he had been involved himself. At the end of the letter, Phil wrote, "I can't take it anymore. I'm sorry." It was clear that Phil couldn't bear his situation any longer and took his own life. It was obvious why he found it hard to talk to anyone about it. Now, I understood why he had previously told me not to worry. Phil. But knowing the truth, I thought I should have listened more to him. I felt overwhelmed by a sense of despair. Thinking of Phil, tears naturally started flowing. However, I couldn't just stop here. I needed to carry out the revenge against my mother-in-law as Phil had asked, to fulfill his last wish. I gripped Phil's letter tightly and resolved to take revenge on my mother-in-law. I've come again. Betty, welcome. Even after Phil's death, I continued to visit my mother-in-law's store. That habit didn't change even after reading the letter. My view of my mother-in-law had changed. The discomfort I felt when the surrounding stores were closing and during the funeral might indeed have been justified. After fully grasping the facts, I could see why Phil felt as he did. Would you like the cake set again today? Yes, please. I'll leave the choice of cake up to you. My mother-in-law smiled warmly and began preparing the cake set swiftly. The shop seemed much more serene than before. Since Phil's passing, my mother-in-law had reduced the operating hours but continued to maintain the shop. Ideally, I should have helped, but due to my job, I could only visit occasionally to see her running the shop alone. However, now that the circumstances had changed, so had the conversation. If it's all right with you, may I help at the shop? I see you working so hard all the time. Feeling compelled to witness the other side of my mother-in-law, I insisted on offering my help. That would be very kind of you, but aren't you tired too, Betty? No, I'm fine. Initially hesitant, my mother-in-law understood my earnest offer and agreed. If that's the case, could I ask for your help? If you can help, maybe we can extend the business hours a bit. Let's do that. I'll give it my all. I did not want to believe that what Phil had said was a lie. Yet, having depended on my mother-in-law so much, a part of me wanted to believe in her innocence. However, my wish was not to be fulfilled. While preparing to open, I suddenly overheard my mother-in-law speaking to someone. There's a new troublesome store that has opened. I'll pay, so do the same as you did with the previous stores. It was a conversation I should not have heard. The content of the conversation and my mother-in-law's somber voice froze me in place. But with this, I felt I could give up any lingering doubts. I resolved myself and began planning my revenge against my mother-in-law. 2 weeks later, just before opening the shop, I again heard my mother-in-law talking to someone. Yes, that's right. That person's similar. The dark, somber tone of her voice wrapped me in tension. Let's settle on that, and we'll meet again in a week. Understood. See you then. After confirming that my mother-in-law had ended the call, I approached her. Mother-in-law, who were you talking to? Oh, you startled me. Were you here? Yes, I've been here for a little while. Who were you talking to? Having asked, there was no turning back. I pressed on. It's someone you don't need to worry about. Let's continue getting ready. I've finished the preparations. Could you tell me who you were talking to instead? As I persisted, my mother-in-law gave me a cold look. I told you, it's not your concern. It was a conversation with the gangsters, wasn't it? It's pointless to try and hide it. With that, I placed the USB and photos that Phil had given me on the counter. My mother-in-law's eyes widened in shock. She let out a deep sigh, as if realizing she could no longer hide anything. What is this? These are the things Phil left behind. They are proof of your connections with the gangsters and that you've been using them to sabotage other stores. There are contracts, everything, all the agreements you made with them, it's all in the USB. I would like to say it's all fabricated, but if you know this much, there's no point in hiding. Yes, I did have connections with the gangsters and used them to ruin other stores. Although my mother-in-law admitted it rather easily, she then shockingly added, "But really, this should be forgivable, right? If someone didn't want their shop destroyed, they shouldn't have opened so close to mine." That is far too selfish. There are people who dream of opening shops in this area. Why is it wrong for them to realize their dreams? This place doesn't belong to you alone. Enough with the noise. What other people think doesn't matter. It's wrong for them to interfere with my business. With that, my mother-in-law slammed the counter in anger. They all try to pull me down. Why can't they stand to see me succeed? Phil too. If he didn't like the situation, he should have just left quietly without saying anything. What are you saying? That he should have just left silently? That's not what I'm trying to convey. There are proper ways to do things. Conspiring with gangsters for the sake of a business is unthinkable. Do you realize that is a crime? A crime? That's irrelevant. If it's not discovered, whatever you do is no problem. In fact, if Phil hadn't told you, you wouldn't even know, right? Unable to refute her words, I lowered my head. Seeing this, my mother-in-law gloated. "You didn't know anything, did you? Poor thing, you got dragged into this?" Dragged into what? Exactly. I never imagined Phil would be afraid of the gangsters and leave evidence. At that moment, I became curious about how my mother-in-law really viewed Phil. I had always assumed that she loved Phil, but perhaps that was not the case. "What do you think about Phil?" Listening to my question, my mother-in-law chuckled lightly and answered, "I don't really care. Well, honestly, he might have been a nuisance." What? I was stunned by her unexpected response. Pleased with my reaction, she continued, "I was trying to cooperate with the gangsters for the benefit of the shop, and he rejected that. Despite claiming it was for the sake of the shop, he annoyingly refused and became a real bother. Eventually, he had to agree with me. But the love I had for him faded after his rejection. I think he never really considered the shop's interests." Phil was making a valid point. If he's my son, he should understand my perspective. Whether it's reasonable or not isn't the issue. Children should quietly listen to their parents. She sneered maliciously. She still didn't fully comprehend what she had done or why Phil resisted. Or perhaps she understood, but simply refused to acknowledge it. However, regardless of the reason, what she did was clearly wrong. How do you feel about Phil's death? Don't you think it was your fault? There's no way I would think that. Dwelling on things that have already passed is pointless. Didn't your actions put a lot of pressure on Phil? His letter said he couldn't take it anymore. The involvement with the gangsters, the burden of heavy secrets, it all became too much for him. You're being rather annoying. What? Playing detective? Don't you think that's ridiculous? My mother-in-law shouted angrily. She interrupted me and glanced at the evidence on the counter in front of us. By the way, are you really okay with leaving this here? Something like this. Angry, my mother-in-law grabbed the evidence photos and started tearing them up. Wait, I shouted, but she ignored me. And the USB should be destroyed too, she said, trying to snatch the USB from my hand as I reached for it. Don't touch it, my mother-in-law snapped. She grabbed the USB and threw it into a can filled with water. What are you doing? I asked in shock. Now all the evidence is gone. Since you know everything now, we are accomplices. Do you understand your position? She said coldly. I indeed know everything, but that's because Phil entrusted me to take revenge on you. He deeply regretted his involvement with the gangsters. He couldn't bear it and took his own life. My guess is that he tried several times to convince you to cut ties with them, I replied calmly. My mother-in-law gave me a cold look. Why did you ignore Phil's words? Did you just get caught up in immediate profits and choose the wrong path? Be quiet. How could you possibly understand? You can't run from this. I understand Phil's true intentions. Just shut up. At that moment, my mother-in-law suddenly grabbed my collar and forcefully threw me to the ground. Caught off guard by the sudden violence, I was thrown into a panic. Ouch. Do you realize what you've done? You've destroyed my life because of your actions. You should never have engaged in such strange behavior in the first place. Silence. Can't you just listen quietly? It was the first time I had seen my mother-in-law this agitated. Normally, I would have been scared, but for some reason, I felt no fear. You are. As my mother-in-law reached for my collar again, the sound of the store door opening interrupted us. What are you doing? Why is the police here? I called the police before talking to you. She released my collar, and her face showed shock. Indeed, before speaking to my mother-in-law, I had gone to the police to explain the situation and submitted the evidence, so they were already aware of the circumstances. Ideally, I should have gone to confront her with the police, but I wanted to hear the truth directly from her first, so I spoke with her while the police waited nearby. Please explain in detail. You need to come with us, the police said as they moved my mother-in-law away from me and directed her toward the patrol car. Wait. You were deceiving me, my mother-in-law suddenly shouted. What do you mean by that? What deceit? I asked calmly. That you had called the police. Continuing with anger, my mother-in-law seemed overwhelmed. I slowly got up and watched as she was led away. You always care only about Phil. Please be quiet, the police officer instructed. She complied and started walking toward the patrol car again. Her back looked smaller than ever, as if the weight of her guilt was literally pressing down on her, crushing her under its burden. While I was unsure if the method of revenge Phil sought was right, all he had entrusted me with was the wish to see it fulfilled. However, with the involvement of the police, the crimes of my mother-in-law and her connections with the gangsters were exposed, ensuring that their wrongdoing would not prevail. From the evidence Phil left behind and my mother-in-law's attempts to sever ties with the gangsters, I was convinced this was the revenge Phil had desired. I truly believed I had avenged Phil's unresolved grievances. Returning home, I looked at Phil's portrait. Phil, we did it, I said. Considering that this form of revenge was what Phil had wanted, I felt it was the right outcome. Reflecting on Phil's efforts to stop his mother from getting involved with the gangsters and the extent of his struggle, It's clear his feelings were profound. Now, as I pray before Phil's portrait, I am genuinely glad that I could avenge him. Subsequently, more of my mother-in-law's crimes came to light, and she was convicted in court. Additionally, several gang members involved were arrested. According to the police, all the crimes committed by my mother-in-law were related to her store. It's not hard to imagine that in her desperation to protect her business, she resorted to various illegal activities. While I can understand her motives, there surely was a right way to handle things. Perhaps a different approach could have prevented Phil from taking his own life. No one seeks a future where no one can be happy. I find myself nostalgic for the early days when she opened her store, times that were peaceful and joyful. If possible, I often think I would return to those happier times. Since this incident came to light, I have completely cut off my relationship with my mother-in-law. The last expression I saw on her face was one of anger as she was being taken away by the police. 2 years have passed since then, and I have moved to a new place, living a peaceful life. Occasionally, I remember my mother-in-law's angry face, but it didn't become a trauma. However, the fear from that time was intense, and I strongly feel that I never want to experience anything like it again. After everything settled, I made a thank you call to Bart. He had been worried about me and seemed to have been living uneasy days as well. I wonder what future would have awaited if Bart hadn't passed on the letter, if I hadn't upheld Phil's wish. I earnestly hope that this peaceful life continues. That is my greatest wish. Believing that Phil continues to watch over me, I hope to maintain this peaceful life.